Daphna Joel was in Melbourne to give a talk at the University of Melbourne in the Florey Neuroscience series. The talk was called Rethinking Brain and Gender Beyond the Binary. And I took this opportunity to have a discussion with Daphna and also Cordelia Fine. So let me just very briefly introduce them and then we'll jump to the discussion. Daphna Joel is a professor of neuroscience and psychology at Tel Aviv University in Israel. And she is the author of the book Gender Mosaic, which was published in 2019. Cordelia Fine is professor in history and philosophy of science at the University of Melbourne. She's the author of Testosterone Rex, which came out in 2017, which also won the Royal Society Science Book Prize. She's also the author of an earlier book, Delusions of Gender, which came out in 2010. And her latest book, which has just been published, is called Patriarchy, Inc.
Okay, so we're talking about whether there are two types of persons, and let's just start with the absolute basics of that claim. Are there two types of persons in at least some respect? Let's start with Daphna.
Okay. So I think when it comes to reproduction, we can reproduce as humans as either male or female, but we need to remember that not everyone can reproduce, and no one can reproduce throughout their lives. So sometimes we are too young or too old. So in this sense, there are two types of people, or three, because one type cannot reproduce at all throughout their life. But then this becomes a very important question just because of social reasons.
If someone heard the question just as meaning, are there two reproductive types or reproductive roles, we could answer yes, there are two types of persons. So what's a way of thinking about the types that maybe captures what's at stake in the public fight over this issue?
So I think these two types of reproduction, in many cultures, including our culture, they carry a lot of meaning beyond the role in reproduction.
Yeah.
And then people assume that this binary division into two reproductive system extends beyond the reproductive system into brain, behavior, mind, whatever. So different sex roles, different expectations, different preferences, etc.
Mm-hmm. So could we, is there some way to set up like an official story or like roughly for the viewer what the two types are? So male, female would be the sex. What's the other stuff? It's like being straight, being...
Right. So the assumption is that people born male will be attracted to females,
Yep.
will have a gender identity of a man, will have a set of psychological and behavioral characteristics we may term masculinity, and obviously will have the neural substrates subserving all of this a male brain. And similarly, humans with born female will have a gender identity of a woman, will be attracted to males, will have a set of psychological characteristics we can term feminine, and obviously have a female brain.
Great. Okay. So let's call one cluster men, one cluster women, although of course there's terminological fights to be had. So your man cluster is male, attracted to female, masculine, and has a kind of brain that underwrites all of that. And then your woman is female, attracted to males, feminine, and has a brain that underwrites all of that.
Right.
Okay, two types of persons. What is the strongest form, as in like if we're going to like steel man our opponents before we knock them over, what's the strongest form of the two types of persons claim, and where is all the action at? Maybe that we go to you, Cordelia, on the controversial part of that. Where is the fight being had at the moment?
Right. So I think this is a really nice question because, first of all, there's actually a fight going on even about the more reproductive elements of things. I would say
Fights everywhere.
Yeah, fights everywhere, right down to the basics. So, but I think we'll set that aside. So I suppose it's something. One way to look at it is saying what are the parts of this these two types we've talked about: gender identity, sexual orientation, masculinity. Which are the ones that are sort of most tightly correlated with sex, right?
Yeah.
And I think even they're all contested. So if you're asking me which seems like the most compelling explanation for yes, this is follows really strongly from sex, one argument might say is, well, it might be things that where you have the largest sex differences, okay, and maybe that's the most sort of biologically driven by sex-related genes and hormones, or it might be the ones that are most universal, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But I think whereas where you have things like forms of masculinity that are sort of very clearly cross-culturally variant, for example, then that's a much easier kind of man to set fire to. We're talking about straw men, right?
Yeah.
But I think even when you have really tight correlations, or you have universal, you see these sort of separations between males and females universally, it's still not obvious that that's something that's sort of deeply biologically rooted. So just to give the example of gender identity, so every human society that we know of has a gender system, part of which are these gender categories. These always include gender categories that are based on sex, boys, girl, man, woman. Some societies have additional gender categories. And, the sex difference in gender identity, identifying as a man, identifying as a woman, like that's a huge sex difference. But of course, not everyone who is male identifies as a man, or everyone who's female identifies as a woman. But, you can say, look, we have a cultural environment. First of all, we have physical differences between the sexes that make them easily discernible differences. So babies, even in the first year of life, are already starting to discriminate between males and females and starting to create sort of different categories for those spaces. We're using language that is using these gender categories. The child around about the age of 2 then gets this sense of themselves as a gender identity. So there's this debate even about gender identity. Is it something that's a kind of, internal innate identity that just sort of unfurls itself? Is it just constructed through development? And the fact that that there are people who do not identify as the sex with which they're born, and who, as far as we know, don't seem to have atypical hormones or genes or anything like that. It points to this being a developmental process. So to me, the environment is offering us enough developmental resources to say even this really powerfully correlated with sex difference of gender identity might be something that doesn't take much in terms of biological resources to ensure that it's it develops and is inherited each generation, because that culture that has the gender categories and the way we talk to children and the division of the world, that's part of your inherited resources. So
can I just clarify?
Yeah.
I think if we have any gender critical watchers, which is likely, they're going to be tripped up by how you're using the term gender identity. Is it fair to reinterpret what you just said as self-ascription as girl or boy, male or female? You're just talking about self-ascription, and you're saying that like self-labeling or self-ascription or self-categorizing seems to be a very early and very reliable large sex difference.
Mm-hmm.
And then there would just be a question of like, how does that fit in with thinking about those people who identify the other way or want to ascribe to the other category? It's not necessarily relying on the gender identity concept of contemporary trans activism, right?
So first, we don't know what gender identity is. So
Okay.
People have been talking about this for many, many, many years.
Yeah.
And the meaning of gender identity keeps changing. So the way we talk about it now is not the same as John Money, for example, described it.
Yeah.
And in recent years, actually, the meaning of gender identity really divorced from the body.
Yeah.
So when it was highly connected to the body and to sex roles, it is now divorced from both.
Yeah.
And the plurality of gender identities suggests, but some at least researchers think that it's a sense of self. So people actually are talking about a sense of self.
Yeah.
And then it is gendered because gender is such a important and salient feature of or organizing feature of our society.
Yeah.
So you have to relate to it. You can agree or disagree with the gender label that you get, but when you transition from a baby to a child, then you transition from a baby to a boy or a girl.
Right.
What a big girl, what a big boy, whatever.
Yeah.
So don't be a baby, right? Be a boy, be a girl. So you have to somehow relate to these categories. And most people will just accept them, and some people may reject them. But the question is whether this sense of self is related to the body is an open question. So we don't know.
Right. So, but in the sense of it being an answer to the question about like maybe what are the largest sex differences, and then even then what is their best explanation, like what's a controversial topic, should we just read that as like, oh, a huge sex difference, like actual sex, huge sex difference is that females tend to be like happy to call themselves girls or identify themselves into the girl
I
tribe?
don't know if it's a sex difference.
Okay.
No, it's maybe most people just accept whatever society puts on them, and there are some rebels that don't.
Good,
So,
but then isn't there different?
No, there
Then
is
it's
no
not a
sex
sex
difference.
exactly. But I'm just
Right.
like as an answer to what are the largest.
I think the sexual attraction would be the largest.
Okay,
Yeah, I mean, look, when you look at the when you look at the studies that are looking at females who have been exposed to atypically high androgens, they have measures of gender identity, and they're presenting that as a sex difference. Like there's a questionnaire, and boys tend to respond one way because they identify as boys and they're satisfied with that, and girls. So you can create a measure of gender identity where you can say, look, here is a sex difference. We've got some people identifying this way and some people identifying
and that
way.
means
Yeah.
self-ascription into the relevant tribe.
Kind of gendered self-conception of myself as a or a girl or a man or a woman. But yeah, so I mean, I think so sexuality is another interesting one. So one of the really sort of mind-boggling studies that we came across actually when we were doing some work together, collaborating together, was around sexual imprinting. So you think, if you're a male sheep, a ram, in order to be reproductively successful, you got to be sexually attracted to ewes. Otherwise, if you get the wrong species,
like lions.
Like, sorry,
lions.
Yeah,
if they get attracted to lions, they will be killed.
That's a good point. If you've got a really bad farmer who's got the lions in the yes,
high stakes.
Yeah. So the study was a little bit less, was a bit lower risk. So they cross fostered them with goats instead, like nanny goats, and then these baby male lambs grew up to be sexually attracted to the female goats instead of the female sheep. So you think this is something that is, whenever you look at sheep, there's a bit of, not all sheep are acting in completely straight ways, but they're generally going to be attracted to other sheep as this really kind of, reliable, reproductively important behavior. And yet it depends on this aspect of the environment that in the normal circumstances, if you're a baby lamb and you're going to survive, then you're going to be with your mum, right? But when the experimenters come along and go, what happens if we rear it with a goat? That's when you realize that this seemingly kind of what you might assume was a biologically rooted instinct to be attracted to the same species actually depends on this external developmental resource. So I'm not saying that humans are sort of sexual imprinters in the same way, but I guess I'm just saying it's hard to pick out a single kind of characteristic of sex differences that can enable us to say, aha, okay, so this must be really tightly linked to the biological aspects of sex.
I do want to add something about the controversy around the body, which I agree. And this is what I was trying to say before. So there is controversy about how you define who is male and who is female and intersex, etc. But this controversy is not biological. It's just because these categories are so important socially. Okay, so they are not important for biology. Some people that we define as intersex nowadays, they actually can reproduce as males or females. So in terms of biology, they have no problem. Okay.
Yeah.
So and the fact that some people do not want to reproduce or they're too young or old to reproduce, again, it's not a biological problem. It's only for us that being male or being female is so important socially. It dictates so many aspects of our life that this becomes a problem of how we should identify or define what's male or what's female. And if we weren't concerned about this socially, then we wouldn't have this debate even. So just to give an example, with handedness, which is not important nowadays, but it used to be important not many years ago.
Yeah.
And then you had very complex tests to define if someone is a right-handed or left-handed, which now we wouldn't bother. Yes, some things I do with my right hand, some with my left leg, but I'm not concerned whether I'm really right-handed or maybe I'm mixed or whatever. Okay,
right,
so
right.
This is just to make, and it's not that handedness does not exist, it does, but whether it's binary or not and how to define it, was only an issue because it was socially important, not because it's physiologically important in some sense.
But then are you saying there's like two different ways to hear you, right? One is this is just a social or political issue. And so anything going on in the biology that pretends it's more complicated than it actually is sort of politicized. The kinder, maybe softer way to hear it is, no, the fact that it's so important socially creates new, needs in science or something? Or like, I guess.
So first it creates problems. So people, for example, that we now define as intersex, obviously they have a problem in current society.
Right.
From unwanted interventions in early age to stigma, etc.
Yeah.
And also the other side is for some people. So if I want to reproduce and I have some problems, then obviously this is a medical condition I want to solve. So it is important to solve this for people, but not for social reason, but for medical reason for those interested.
Yes.
So what I'm saying is that there could be real problems for some people because they want to reproduce, for example, this is a main issue and cannot, and we want to solve this. But the entire discussion, social discussion around this is because it's socially important. It's not around the medical issues.
No, I agree.
It's just around the classification.
Yeah, I was sort of just trying to figure out if there is a lesson for, because there are scientists out in the public sphere saying that sex is much more complicated than we would ever have thought. You said it's one of the fights. And the initial motivation does seem to have been like intersex cases. And I'm just trying to figure out, is it like for a social reason it has become more scientifically complicated, but it isn't really? Or is it like, no, it kind of has, for a social reason, created a new set of science questions almost. So
yeah, it does. But I'm saying some of these scientific questions are really important because they can affect people's life in good ways.
Yes.
Okay. Because for me, sex is about reproduction and whether you can reproduce as a male or a female.
Yes.
If you cannot reproduce for whatever reason, this is something that you as a person would like to solve, and we would like medicine, science to help these people solve it, as we would like to solve other issues that humans are not satisfied with, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the complexity that you are talking about, and I think that you are referring to, is not about this.
Yeah.
Because it's a problem also for intersex people who could reproduce. So the people that are making this complex are just because we want to classify these people and we can't really classify these people, and they don't worry about whether they can reproduce or not.
Right.
They just want to classify them so they know how to treat them.
But I think part of the issue is, so you've got some people who are saying, they go with the gamete definition and they say, the gamete definition brings us lots of things, it unites the human male with the male asparagus, right? It's really important in terms of evolutionary thinking that we have these two, in sexually reproducing species. It helps us understand, the evolution of sexual reproduction and sex roles and all this sort of thing, right? But there's this great piece by Paul Griffiths, the philosopher of biology, in Aeon or Ion, however you pronounce it, and he's saying, that definition of sex, the gamete definition of sex, is a really useful one for evolutionary biologists, and we shouldn't say goodbye to it, but is not necessarily one that's very helpful for the kinds of things that are of concern for people who aren't engaged in theorizing in evolutionary biology.
So I guess you've given us two nice examples of where there are large observed sex differences. So you mentioned gender identity and sexual orientation. So if we're just thinking in terms of like we have these differences and then there's various ways to try to explain them away, debunk them or whatever, and we think about the social and cultural explanations. So you mentioned the environment reliably providing animals of the same species so that you don't get your attractions wrong. Is it plausible that there would be a social or cultural explanation for all of the observed or purported sex differences that go into these two types of persons? What are the prospects for like a full social and cultural debunking?
Okay, so maybe I would answer it slightly differently. So the first thing is I think it raises this really important question. So sometimes I haven't written about much about sexual orientation or gender identity. Usually the kinds of masculine and feminine traits that I've been interested in are the ones that relate to why we see such differences in the labour market. So we see segregation between so-called men's jobs and women's jobs, and also vertical segregation in terms of who reaches the top of organisations. So those have been the kinds of characteristics that I've been interested in. And whenever one way to think about it is people assume that if something is an adaptive trait, a sort of sex-specific adaptive trait, then it must be passed on through inherited biology. And that was the common dominant way of thinking and of doing sex differences research for a long time. And then there was this sort of recognition that there were these other routes by which sex could get its work done. So one way is that obviously sex doesn't just create sex differences in the brain, have sex effects, it also creates sex differences in the body, and then other individuals in the environment around that animal or person can then respond differently because of those physiological differences. It might be appearance, smell, plumage, whatever it might be. The animal's behavior can also affect their sex-related biology, like most often, obviously, their hormones, but also gene expression, right? So there's this, instead of just from sex-related biology through the brain through behavior, you've got this sort of reverse causation from behavior back into biology. So that becomes very complex. And then so this all happens in non-human animals, but then in humans, obviously, we have this thing called gender. And I think a lot of people think about, in these debates, there's a sort of people who say, I'm taking an evolutionary perspective, and then there's this blank slate view where it's all just, it's a kind of non-evolutionary account. But gender is sort of that's another way of getting the work done. So we have culturally evolved gender roles. And so we can, there's actually a lovely diagram of this from your paper with Margaret McCarthy, where you've got, got your sex-linked genes and hormones. You've got that coming through to your outcomes. So that's, the endpoints, so whether it's the brain or behavior. But then you've got the sex going through to the body leading back to the sex, the environment, the gender. So it's all a big interacting system. And so then the question becomes, the sort of, I guess, the relative importance of gender in humans versus this sex-linked biology. And there's potentially like a quite different answer depending on which trait you're talking about. So as I said before, when you're talking about things that are sort of, very cross-culturally variable, it seems like if you look at different cultures, there's quite different endpoints possible in terms of whether you even see sex differences or perhaps they're even reversed. It's not to say that there's no biological contribution at all, that there's nothing happening in the genes or the hormones that's affecting the brain in some way, but it's just that when we think about this developmental trajectory, it actually seems like this external to biology stuff is sort of more important in terms of what those endpoints tend to be. Does that make sense?
Yes, although I wonder if then some people are going to hear that as like a long way of saying that it's biological after all. It's just that it's got this intermediate thing going on where it's like, oh, it's not directly biologically mediated, but it's like we're the kinds of creatures that can set up these very reliable cultural institutions that will then scaffold the division of labor, and then we'll end up with the two types of persons, but it's not exactly because of testosterone or brains. What's your response? Like, why is it more of a compromised answer, or why is it more on the social side than I'm
No, I think the cross-fostering, if you focus on the cross-fostering example Cordelia gave before, this is the answer.
Animals, that's the animals one.
Right.
Yeah.
Because then you see that it's nothing imprinted in these animals. So they are not born with an inclination to be attracted to their own species.
Yes.
It's only culturally, or environmentally.
Yeah.
Right. And in evolution, you inherit also an environment and a culture. So,
but only we inherit a culture.
No,
right?
They also inherit. I mean, you can talk about this as environment, but you can, beavers. So they inherit also the dams that the parents built.
Yeah.
Okay, so call it a culture, call it an environment. So you don't only inherit genes, and this is a new development in evolution theory that needs to be adapted into the domain of sex differences, and we've tried to do this. But if you just take this example, then something that again has a huge evolutionary importance, that you are sexually attracted to your own species and not to another species, is completely dependent on environmental factors and is not encoded at all at the level of your genes.
Yeah.
So this is what Cordelia is saying. We can see some sex differences, some sex roles, for example, that we can think that are important evolutionary, but this is not a proof that they are encoded in our genes.
No, agreed. Sorry, I think I was just trying to get at someone who is more on the like evolutionary explanations side.
No, so this is an evolutionary explanation.
Agreed. It's an evolutionary explanation, not a purely social explanation in the way that some people have wanted. So I'm just sort of trying to probe at like,
no,
whose side is this explanation on, or whose cause does this advance? Because in a way it's quite contingent. The niche could change, the environmental pressures could change, things could be different. But on the other hand, if humans are reliably
right, but then
culturally,
if it's not encoded in our genes, and it's also only cultural inheritance, then if you change the culture, the behavior will change.
Yes,
as happens with these young sheep or whatever.
Yeah.
Right? You change their environment, the behavior change immediately.
Yes.
So, but are you saying, Cordelia, you seem to be saying that we've got these two sex categories, and we're the kind of creatures that build gender roles and culture around those. So it's a kind of indirect effects we create of the
that's how beaver dams are gender.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting question. So there's one anthropologist called Joseph Henrich who actually has suggested that we are born with a kind of, I don't want to use the word instinct, but like an inherent tendency to be interested in what members of the same sex are doing.
Yeah.
So he says, look, the reason for this is that we've had gender division of labor, or sex division of labor, for tens of thousands of years, and that's been long enough for there to have been this gene culture co-evolution, so that the kids who were kind of the girls that are looking at their mums, and the boys that are looking at their dads, and the other men in the community were more successful, so blah blah blah. So this is you can kind of try and empirically test this question.
Yeah.
Maybe, but it's also possible that it's certainly true that children do tend to imitate people of the same sex, or actually, when it comes to children who are identifying as trans, with the gender with which they identify. But it's easy enough to see how that could have come about through sort of social learning, so that you're just sort of learning the association between, you get a bit more rewarded when you tend to be copying people who are the same sex as you, or that you, once you have your gender identity, that seems like a more helpful person to copy. But yeah, I mean, so the philosopher of science, Cailin O'Connor, she's argued that she thinks that the division of the reason that we have these gender systems at all is because sex categories is such a convenient way of dividing labour. So you've got community, you've got roughly equal numbers, it's easy to tell who's male, it's easy to tell who's female, even if one sex doesn't have an advantage over the other in terms of what kind of, doing this kind of task or another kind of task. It's more efficient if you start to teach, girls, you're the basket weavers, boys, you're the musical instrument makers, whatever it is. And then the whole gender system is built on top of that.
Right.
So it's biological in the sense that you've got like roughly 50-50 and you've already got different reproductive roles, so it's very salient.
Yeah.
Right. So to me, it's much easier to imagine a kind of post-racial future than a post-gender future. But that's a bit different to saying these gender roles are kind of inscribed in our genes or hormones.
So I guess, yeah, maybe we've talked a little bit about the way that there can be explanations of difference on the social and cultural side, and the way that might be evolutionarily scaffolded without being in the genes. If we can go to the more on the physiological, biological side, in the public debate, there's a lot of pointing at testosterone as the kind of man maker, king maker explanation of aggression, violence, whatever on the male side. I mean, have you thought about this at all?
Just a bit, yeah. Yeah. So in Testosterone Rex, I was looking at this idea that testosterone drives sort of quintessential facets of masculinity, particularly risk-taking and competition. And, one of the things that I looked at was, for example, just how complex risk-taking is. So we tend to think of it as just a sort of a single trait on a continuum. There are risk-averse people and risk-taking people, and actually a lot of the questionnaires that we use to measure risk-taking assumed that. So we bundle all different kinds of risk-taking together, and then you just add it up and see what kind of, what your score is, right? And when you think of risk-taking in that way, it's really easy to think of, oh, well, we've got the sliding scale from the risk-averse to risk-taker. So, maybe testosterone explains why men are more risk-taking than women.
Yeah.
But it turns out risk-taking is much more complex than this. It's very domain-specific. So if you're a physical risk-taker, you're not necessarily a financial risk-taker. And of course, if that's the case, then it's much harder to see how there can be this sort of type link between testosterone and risk-taking, for example.
Yeah.
Then, of course, when you start to look cross-culturally, and there's been more and more of this research as there's been pressure on the social sciences to stop treating North American students or North American and Western European populations more generally as sort of standing in for the entire human population. So we're just seeing more and more variation and diversity in the kinds of sex differences that we see in different populations. So you might hear people talking about sex differences and agreeableness, like females being more agreeable is just a kind of pan-universal sex difference. Well, actually it isn't. There are many countries where men are more, on average, are more agreeable than women. So of course all of this variation and diversity starts to put pressure on this argument that it's testosterone that's driving these masculine traits, because what's masculine one's
right
population is not necessarily masculine in another.
Could your diehard fan of testosterone as the explanation just sort of always say, oh, like wherever you don't see these particular behaviors, something else is just like interfered or distorted? Like the dogmatist, is that right? That they can just sort of always come up with a story to explain away some variation, so long as it's like, I was going to say minority, but actually it could even be majority variation, right? You could still have a story that explains it.
Yeah, you could say, oh, well, look, we're supposed to see this sex difference, but it's somehow being suppressed by cultural norms. Yeah, so that's an argument that some evolutionary psychologists would make, like David Schmidt. He would say, yeah, sometimes you have this sort of moderated sex differences because either culture is ramping down a sort of evolved sex difference or it's enhancing it.
Yeah.
I mean, so one problem, like one note to say about that as a scientific explanation is you start to get a lot of degrees of freedom. So it's like whatever you see, we can explain it. So that means you actually
it's not an explanation.
Yeah, you actually can't.
Yeah.
I think a second problem with that is, it often comes in the argument is that what we're seeing in our contemporary cultures is sort of maximum freedom. So we're seeing, finally in, rich gender egalitarian countries, we're finally seeing women and men sort of represent, expressing their true innate nature. So you sometimes see an argument of that kind.
Right.
I mean, one difficulty with that is that our environments are about, as in the whole of sweep of human history, Western, educated, rich, industrialized, democratic societies. That's not how humans have lived for almost all of our human history. So it'd be very strange if this was the environment in which we sort of finally expressed our authentic feminine and masculine selves. But I think a sort of a more basic question is just thinking about development. So if we think about one sex difference that is, pretty universal, which is a sex difference in, really serious forms of violence, so physical aggression. So as physical aggression gets sort of less serious, so to say, actually the sex differences get smaller, and there are even a few countries where you don't see sex differences, which is quite surprising, but there you are. But when you got the really serious forms, you do see a sort of, it's always men are massively overrepresented among those people who are, ending up in prison for, their serious assault and murder and so on. So, but then the question is, like, are you going to think about that as there's this, testosterone essence that is driving men towards these sort of highly aggressive urges, but then thank God culture manages to suppress that through keeping a lid on it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's one way of looking at it. Another way of thinking about it is actually that what's going on, and this comes from Lise Elliott, it's the way she thinks about the sex difference in extreme physical aggression, is that there probably is some biological contribution that's making boys more vulnerable, sort of medically and developmentally, to early adverse or stressful environments. You have that in combination with the fact that children tend to segregate, gender segregate in childhood, so they're tending to play with other boys in an environment where there are masculine norms about how you play. And her suggestion is that all children have these initial aggressive impulses. I remember this researcher saying something like, if 2-year-olds were human-sized, we'd have to put them all in prison because, they have these aggressive, they're hitting people, right? And, they have to learn how to suppress it. And she's saying, there's a small group of boys, many more boys than girls, but that because of these, this early developmental vulnerability and these other factors, a small number of them end up on this violent trajectory.
Yeah.
But that's quite different to saying that everyone sort of all the boys are pushed on that trajectory because of their testosterone, but for most of them, the culture pushes them back. So everyone's on a kind of developmental trajectory. Got a few people sort of atypical who are off on that violent trajectory, and most people are like, okay, yeah, actually, I'm not suppressing aggressive urges. I'm on a different developmental trajectory.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is quite consequential for all of the. Oh, now I sound like a men's rights feminist. I was just thinking that it's quite consequential for all of the nice men who, because one of the ways of telling the story is like these are really beasts, but we've successfully put enough of them in chains that we can relax a little bit. But it's quite a negative view of the male, right?
Yeah.
I maybe have that view, I have to say. And so then it's that way of telling the story is much more generous to most men. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not trying to be generous to men. I don't want to
misread me.
I don't want to be ungenerous to men either. But to me, that feels like a more plausible explanation of what's going on, and the fact that, at least in our cultures, so few men actually engage in physical aggression.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. We've sort of been maybe antagonizing to Daphna. We've been just talking as though there are really these observed differences, and what could possibly explain them. Like it's the social explanation or a biological explanation, and of what kind. Okay, I know you think about this in a slightly different way, and we've just heard you talk about that, but some of these guys might have not. So please tell us.
Okay, but it's not antagonistic, it's actually orthogonal.
Okay,
Orthogonal.
Okay, good.
No, but I think it's important. So the nature-nurture debate, which, we also wrote about this together, so it's not unfamiliar or antagonistic to me.
Okay, good.
But what I discovered, and this is from animal studies on sex differences in the brain of animals. So this is how it came about. So it wasn't like a theoretical, it was an observation that sex differences can be opposite under different conditions. And this brings a whole new way of looking at this. So even if you take the story of testosterone, so it's not that testosterone has a similar effect on all men, but then culture may interfere, moderate, whatever, suppress it. But rather that maybe testosterone in some conditions does take whoever has testosterone this way, but in another set of conditions actually has an opposite effect.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know anything about this and aggression, but I do know that in the brain this often happens. So in the brain, you could see many examples that you see a sex difference under some set of conditions, and then you change the environmental conditions and the sex difference reverses.
And can you just clarify, when you talk about the brain, you now mean in the structure of the brain?
Structure of the brain, yeah. So I'm talking about brain structure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so this is a very different angle.
Yeah.
So I don't care why we have the sex difference, but just the fact that other factors can reverse it means that we need to rethink about how these affect. So biology can, obviously, I think biology has many effects. So testosterone, estradiol, progesterone, we know that they have effects on many different aspects of brain anatomy and brain function. But how they affect these features may be opposite under different conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one important point.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I discovered is that these interactions of sex and other factors do not just flip the whole brain from a male form to a female form, but rather they are very specific to different features. And as a result, you do not end up with a brain that has only masculine or only feminine or only male typical or only female typical features, but rather a mosaic. So each brain has both features that are more common in males and features that are more common in females.
So we at the start, we did these kind of bundles of the man and the woman, and one part of the bundle was having this type of brain that underpins the other features in the bundle, the sexual orientation, the gender expression, femininity, masculinity. So you're saying when you look at this question of the underlying brain types that might explain the rest of the bundle, there are no types.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah, and not because there are no differences. So if you take a set of brains of males and females, both in animals and in humans, you may find differences.
Yeah.
But then when you go back to the individual level and see in each level which of these features are in the male typical and which is in the female typical, you'll find out that rarely you find a brain in which all features are in the same form.
Okay. Can you, just in case someone is hearing this for the first time, just go like a little bit slowly, can you give an example of so you say these features, what's the type of thing you might have in mind where there even are multiple of them, such that we can look at whether they are?
So you can look at volume of specific regions, how large or small they are. You can look at the microstructure of the brain, like the dendritic spines, the branching of neurons, the morphology of neurons, the density of neurons. So many, whatever you can measure, you can see sex differences in, and you can see these reversals of sex differences. And it can be even large sex differences. They may disappear. So on one set of conditions, you see them, and then, oops, they are gone, or they are reversed, or they get smaller, or they get larger. And while most people do not know much about the brain, so maybe it's a little difficult to grasp this idea, I think if you go to behaviors, preferences, etc., you can see the same principle. So maybe it can help our audience understand. So you can look at your society and you can describe which are the feminine and which are the masculine traits. But then when you go to the individual, then almost no one has only feminine or only masculine traits. So each one of us has a combination, some feminine and some masculine traits. And the same holds for the brain.
Good. So this is supposed to be a kind of structural analogy from Mosaic behavior or Mosaic personality.
So first we discovered the mosaic in the brain, and then we also showed that this is also true for behavior, but I'm using the behavior because I think people can relate to it. So they can have an image or start to understand an intuition of what it means in the brain.
Yes, good. So again, I'm just going to do that slightly slower and you correct me if I'm wrong. So if you went to behavior, you might have thought there's just the Barbie and the Ken, like the two types of person.
Or a continuum.
Or a continuum,
yeah. Yeah, in fact, that's how they used to measure gender, right? Yeah. It used to be just like, masculine at one end, feminine at the other. You lose a point, add a point, lose a point, add a point.
Is your spectrum now supposed to be something where a person belongs or where a trait is met?
No, it was
a person.
I mean, traits and persons. So you would measure many traits.
Yep.
How masculine or feminine you are, many traits. They would add up together, and then you'll get a score, femininity, masculinity score, on where you are located on a spectrum between feminine and masculine.
I don't know why I'm finding that unhelpful.
Oh, so
let me say the maybe dumb thing, and then you just tell me what. Because I was thinking, if someone really bought into the two types,
right,
and they really thought there's like trad wife and army man, and these guys are like everything you said, that he likes women and she likes men, and blah blah blah, and then you thought, I'll just check whether it's just the odd man who's a bit femme, and the odd lesbian out there or whatever. And then the thought is like, oh, once you really start, you unpack some set of things that are femininity or masculinity, and maybe get a long list, like, is he a florist? How does he present himself? Right. And then the thought is like, oh, but once you actually survey a number of people, it just turns out there is no
right. No one is Ken or
Barbie.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So then the spectrum is a different way of.
I'm saying that's how you're saying people might assume that, and I'm saying it's not just people listening might assume it, but the psychologists who are measuring masculinity and femininity did assume it because that assumption was built into the very way that they were measuring.
And they were trying to give people like whole package, like you, the person, would get a place on that spectrum.
Yeah, right. There you are. There you are. Yeah.
Okay, that's great.
So I'm saying if you felt that way, don't feel bad, because people who are trained to study these things also had the same assumption.
I see.
Yeah, but then it's interesting because we are talking now back in the 1930s, I think, but they actually had different subscales. And they found that the subscales do not correlate. So they already knew, actually, that people are mosaic. The meaning that they don't correlate the subscales, that you can be feminine on one subscale and then masculine on another subscale. So they knew that, but then they still disregarded this and just added it up and put you on a spectrum.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So we are rediscovering things that actually have been out there for almost 100 years now.
Yeah.
But because of the binary, and we started with the binary, so because of the binary framework and the strong belief that there is men and women as two kinds, people were just disregarding the evidence.
Yes, I see. Okay. So one thing we learn about behavior is that maybe the perfect score on every trait, man 1 and woman 1, they are the very rare outliers.
Probably they do not exist.
Probably they don't exist.
They didn't exist in their data. So no one got the perfect score.
Okay. Yeah. So great. That's an even stronger point. So that person is an illusion. Everyone just has some complicated mixture of traits. Okay. And then taking that back to the brain, anyone who thinks there's male and female brains
is mistaken.
Is mistaken in exactly that same structural way.
No, it's even stronger in the brain.
Okay.
Yeah. So we use different methods that I will not go into now, but we showed that knowing the sex category, so knowing whether someone is male or female, doesn't help you to predict the brain structure.
Yeah.
Know whether their brain would be similar or how their brain would be similar or different from any other brain.
Yeah.
So it really, even though sex-related factors affect the brain, because they interact with so many other factors, knowing the sex category doesn't allow you to predict brain structure.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a very strong finding that we find for the brain. When you take many masculinity and femininity traits, people do it's not as strong. Okay.
Okay. Is this the correct snappy version of your finding? You can get a brain and have a good guess as to what sex it came out of, but you cannot get a sex and say anything meaningful about what the brain will look like.
Exactly.
Yes. Okay, good.
So this idea that, for, let's say, testosterone, that it's an essentialist factor that is affecting all men in the same direction.
Yeah.
What at least we know from again, this is going back from a trait or behavioral trait to the brain, but in the brain, it's often not the case. So it's not that testosterone will affect all males in the same way or some brain feature in the same way, but under different conditions, it may actually have the opposite effect.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and this is a very different way of thinking. So yeah, everyone has testosterone. Actually, all females also have testosterone, and testosterone is affecting our brain, but how it will affect our brain, and then maybe also how it will affect our behavior, depends on other factors. And this is why it's not essentialist in the sense that it's not always that testosterone will have this effect. Maybe even having an opposite effect. And it's different than saying that testosterone always has the same effect, but then some other factors may counteract it or oppose it or repress it. But still, testosterone is acting always in the same direction under the whatever nature assumption.
Yeah.
I'm suggesting that naturally testosterone may be acting in different ways under different conditions.
Yeah.
So it's within biology, it's just very different way of looking at what these hormones are doing.
Yeah. Question about like the state of the science, I guess. So when it comes to all of the scientific issues around sex differences, whether we're talking about hormones or brain differences, whatever, how close are we to knowledge?
Oh, knowledge.
Like, is it largely scientifically resolved, but it's just a political matter of getting the word out and changing like old assumptions? Or is there still like very much a live and open scientific debate where there might turn out to be two types of persons after all? And both of you answer, please.
Well, look, I wouldn't put money on the two types of person argument, but let me give you an example of where I think there's a meaningful ongoing scientific debate. So this has to do with going back to the population I mentioned before. These are girls and women who have congenital adrenal hyperplasia, so they're exposed to unusually high, for genetic females, unusually high levels of androgens in utero. And the idea is that this has masculinizing sex effects on the brain. And there's been a huge amount of research trying to look at the kind of the effect, the consequences of that on gendered behavior. And so researchers have looked at all kinds of assumed sex differences in behavior, and it's kind of interesting because some of them were investigated and then they didn't find differences, so they kind of forgot about that. So things like intelligence, mental rotation, dominance, things like this. So actually, those weren't results that
weren't replicated.
Yeah, which is sort of interesting in and of itself, right?
Yeah.
But the ones that really have persisted and are reliable, replicable results are to include gendered activities. Okay, so if you give kids a bunch of boy toys and girl toys, you'll reliably see that the girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia are more likely than girls without the condition to be interested in playing with those boy toys or boy activities. Mm-hmm. And that's always been taken as one of the strongest pieces of evidence that the kind of gendered interests that we see, and of course this is very difficult with humans because non-human animals are playing with toys, or they don't have the same labor market that we do, right? So this is seen as like one of the strongest pieces of evidence that our gendered social structure does have hormonal contributions to it. But But the problem with this research is that there's been a kind of confound, or there hasn't been an attempt to separate what's boy toys have been treated as if they're a kind of, obvious universal characteristic of human history, which is strange when you're talking about a toy car, because cars are a relatively recent invention. And more recently, it's turned out that girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, they're just less sensitive to cues about what's gender normative. So you can say to a bunch of kids, oh, this orange balloon is for girls and this silver balloon is for boys, and the girls and boys will, which balloon would you like? And they'll choose the one that they've been told is for them. The girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia don't show the same effect. So this raises a question of well, what's going on?
Yeah.
Is it that they're just gender non-conforming, or is it something that's happened in their brain that means that they're somehow more drawn to cars than other children? And I think the research, because the research has kind of mixed up these two things, what's considered for boys and for girls in a particular place and time, without a sort of clear hypothesis about what it is they think that this masculinized brain is interested in. There's just no resolution on this question, but I think it is one that is actually empirically tractable.
Yeah.
No, but I don't think anyone, even the two types of people, because toys preferences have changed dramatically, and also there are different nowadays between cultures. So balls, for example, if you look at earlier studies, they used to be classified as boys' toys.
Right.
But now they are classified as gender neutral.
Right.
So is it something about our biology that changed? So obviously it cannot. I don't think anyone would think that testosterone makes boys interested in cars.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So it's something about. You think? That's the one that did the primate stuff, which was not replicated. And
yeah. Or when you look at the meta-analyses, the two strongest, most consistent sex differences that you see are dolls on the one hand and toy cars on the other. But nobody seems to be saying, well, clearly the cars can't be biological. It might have something to do with things that move or objects or something like that. So that would be the argument.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So
tell some story.
And then
so people do.
So people stopped moving, so that they became gender neutral. No, I mean I'm just saying that it's.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. But
I agree.
Yeah, but I think first we just need to introduce the name Melissa Hines, because I think most of these studies are her studies, or many of these studies are her studies with CAH girls, and I think her last, or one of the latest, was a conclusion that actually testosterone is affecting these CAH girls in being less gender conforming.
Yes, but there's sort of different explanations of why that might be. So one explanation is because they have masculinized brains, they have learnt that they're less interested in girl toys. And so when you say, oh, this is for girls, they're like, oh, I'm probably not going to be into that.
Yeah.
The alternative is, for whatever reason that we don't understand, they're not gender self-socializing in the same way, and that's why they're less interested in pink, less interested in the orange.
They should connect this up with the autism research, right? Because isn't that supposed there's stuff there about being less sensitive to social norms, including gender norms? So at least you've got a viable other alternative on the table for why some people are rejecting gender self-categorization or whatever. I take it that has nothing to do with their sex in particular. It has to do with the autism.
But I don't think there is any evidence that CAH girls have more autism than.
Oh no,
I know, but before that, I would like to connect it to what you said earlier. So you could think of an evolutionary theory who says always kids are first they are raised by their mothers. So maybe testosterone is just making boys less likely to use their mother as a model. Okay, and this so girls. I mean, every kid goes after the parent, and also studies show that it's not so much after the same sex, but more about the most dominant parent. And because obviously a mom is a dominant parent, at least in early stages, then maybe in evolution, testosterone was just driving boys a little away from the mother.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then this is what you see in the CAH girls. It's not so much that they are more into boys' toys; they are just less into girls' toys. I think
Yes.
and this will get us the same result.
Yeah.
Because there are only boys' toys and girls' toys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you can also connect it to the fact that actually boys are much more socialized at early ages, so there is much less freedom for boys to behave in girl-like fashion in early ages than there is for girls.
Mm-hmm.
So you can think of society like adding to this. So boys are less likely to go after the parent, the male parent, but then maybe they are just going to go many ways. So society imposes a lot of restrictions on them that they go the boy way. So this is like a kind of evolutionary theory about what testosterone is doing, but then culture obviously will be the one determining what is girls' activities, what are boys' activities, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah. So coming back to right what I was saying at the beginning, you think about what's testosterone doing.
Yeah.
I mean, so we've got like three different hypotheses now, but they're all incorporating biology in some way. It's just quite different explanations of how you're ending up with this gender type behavior.
Yeah. Right.
And I think, when you start to raise these criticisms of these studies, why do you keep using boy toys and girl toys without actually like testing a sort of clear hypothesis of what you think's going on, which people have been criticizing this for literally decades, maybe even almost 50 years probably. And it's seen as being a kind of grasping at straws, sort of nitpicking. But I think that's because there is this assumption that the sort of adaptive gendered behavior, like being maternal and wanting to care for your children, that must be passed on through inherited biology. It can't be, because it's really important. So it couldn't possibly be through gender roles, which many people tend to think of as, the sideshow to the real stuff of evolution, right? So, but I think that's obviously, that's a wrong way of thinking.
Yeah.
And also we know from animals like primates and stuff, if they do not know how to raise their young if they were raised in captivity, not with a mother, etc. So obviously there is a huge part of learned behavior also for parenting, especially in complex animals like primates, and we are primates.
Right. Okay, let's go to our final question. It seems like where we've landed, Cordelia says she's not going to put her money on it that the two types of persons view works out to be true. You have said there are no male or female brains. When we look at behavior, there are no G.I. Joe Barbie people. So then the thought is like, we've got all this science that blows up this idea of the two types of persons hypothesis or view or whatever. Where does that leave us in terms of social sex/gender categories? Are we now gender abolitionists? Are you now rad femmes? What's the social implications?
So if we continue with this question of what testosterone is doing, I want to add another angle to this and ask, why do we care?
Yeah.
Okay, so for me, this is the main question. Whether testosterone is just making boys less modeling their mother, or whether it drives them into boys' toys, why do we care? As a society, why do we care? And my claim is that we're using science here to justify social order, whereas usually we just do the opposite. So we have social ideals, we have social goals like stay healthy, live long, and etc. And then we use science to achieve these goals. We never use science to tell us, you just get old and die. Or, you got cancer, too bad for you, but this is nature. Mm-hmm. So we always do the opposite. We want to stay healthy, and then we go to science and we ask, how should we, or what should we do, or how do we cure disease, etc. But then when it comes to social categories, we just do the opposite. We turn to science and say, see, this is why you have social categories. Forget about equality and stuff. So I think this is a problem. We should not decide or make decisions about our social structure, what is moral and immoral, our social aims, based on science. We should have our decisions. So if we think we want a gender equality, for example, then we should use science to help us get to this point, and not use science to justify why this point or this aim cannot be achieved.
Good. Is one way to say this like you can you can say we take the status quo and then we use science as an attempt to like naturalize it.
Right.
That's the wrong way around. You just want to vindicate the gender order, and then you wheel in your science to say how it's all like totally underpinned by evolution or whatever. Versus what though? Versus just having a very open mind about,
for example, thinking that we do not want to live in a society in which our genitalia determines what we can or cannot do, what we can or cannot want, should not want.
Yeah.
We want to live in a society in which the only distinction is what is appropriate for humans and what is not. And if it's appropriate for humans, then it is appropriate for all humans. And if it's not, then it's not.
Yeah.
And then just if we see sex differences, for example, in aggression, and we think that some form of aggression is really important, then those who are not aggressive enough should get help. Just as if we think that empathy is really important for humans, then those who are not empathic enough for whatever reason, doesn't have to be testosterone, we will help them be more empathic.
Right.
Like if someone really has hard time learning how to read, we will just help them read. Now maybe there is a genetic background to why these people really, or these kids really have hard time to learn how to read. But we will not use this genetic background as a reason to just, scream them and say, okay, they will not go to school.
Mm-hmm.
Probably we will do the other way around. So whether we can develop I don't know now with all the cutting genes, etc., maybe we can develop a genetic cure for these kids. But if not, we will just do an environmental, right? So we will teach them more, we'll give them extra lessons, etc. So the same with sex differences.
Yeah.
This is what I'm saying, that everywhere else, this is like obvious for us.
Yeah.
Right? We will never say, let cancer be cancer. But some people say, let boys be boys.
Yeah, okay, good. And the thought is, on that approach, even if it were to turn out that there was some sex difference for some problem, that's going to be really contingent as to your plans. It's
right.
Not central to some people need help and we help them.
Right. Yeah, and let's assume, although the evidence do not support it, that testosterone was driving aggression. So then what should we say? Okay, let's give them guns. Obviously not, right? So this is why I'm saying I want to look at this from a different angle and just ask, why are we so obsessed with these questions?
Yeah.
And I think we are obsessed with them for the wrong reasons. And this is similar to what we said about the intersex people.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a good point to help people that want to reproduce and for some reason can't. And we have a lot of, huge amount of money going into these fertility issues, etc. That's fine. But we are usually, as a society, obsessed with these questions for the wrong reasons. And the same with sex differences. It's not because we want to advance society into a more moral or just society. We are using it to justify unjust society. And
I mean, I like the way that Daphna talks about it, but I also feel that you can say, yes, we want to achieve gender equality, but it does seem to me that there's what your conception of gender equality is. There's a kind of underlying scientific explanation of sex differences, and if you've got one kind of scientific explanation, your vision of gender equality is going to look quite different to if you have a quite different.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Is it different but equal, or is it humanist?
Yes.
Yeah. And I think
no, but I can I answer to this? So now actually my view is and you would call it gender abolitionist. I want to get rid of the gender social system.
Yeah.
And I have no predictions whether we will have sex differences, so differences between humans with male and female genitalia in a gender-free society. We may, and we will,
to the idea that we might.
Yeah, actually, I think that we would, and also that under different societies, gender free, because every society it may be gender free, but still has culture, and under different environmental conditions, we'll see different differences.
Right.
So it is possible that throughout the world, all societies will be gender free, but still you would see different differences between people with male and female genitalia. Okay, but it wouldn't be an issue, and this is a point. And for example, if your kid wants to play chess, you don't say, well, they have blue eyes. People with blue eyes, they don't do as well as chess. Forget about this kid, it's only for brown eyes kids. But you may do this if he is a girl. right? And you say, come on, this is for boys. Don't worry about this. And the reason that you don't do this for the eye color is not because there is lots of evidence showing that there are no differences in chest abilities between people with blue and brown eyes, just because it has no social meaning.
Right.
So the word I'm imagining is a word in which the sex category has no social meaning except its role in reproduction.
Yeah.
And it's the same like handedness. Okay,
Yeah.
handedness has some, it's important when you play tennis and when you want to sit in a chair, and whether it has this extension on the right side or the left side. So sometimes it is important if you are right-handed or left-handed, but it has no social meaning of status or whatever expectations of what you will be good at or bad. So this is the type of gender-free society I'm talking about.
Yeah. But you think that it doesn't follow from the science, right?
No, it's science should not be used to make social decisions.
Yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to say, that for other stuff, we don't care about reality. So people are still studying anti-aging and want to extend life forever, even though, this is a hard truth that we die. So the fact that something is like if we really discover some really essential thing about sex, then we will say, okay, but this is the limits of what we can do. In other domains, this doesn't work. We go to the moon, we are trying not to die, okay? So science is used exactly to achieve these unachievable or unimaginable goals. Science is never a reason to say, no, we cannot, leave Earth and go somewhere else.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's been super interesting.
Thank you, Holly.
Thank you.